Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, January 22nd, 1943. The air here isn't breathed, it's drunk. The humidity saturates the lungs, the heat exceeds 40 degrees Celsius in the shade, and the smell. The smell is a sweet and nauseating mixture of decaying vegetation accelerated by the tropical climate, mixed with the odor of bodies that couldn't be buried. This is the green hell, the place where the American war machine was mired up to its knees in mud and fear. In this apocalyptic scenario, where a second lieutenant's life expectancy was measured in weeks, John George disembarked at the makeshift dock. Around him, thousands of Marines carried the standard weight of the Army. Mass-produced M1 Garand rifles, covered in military grease to prevent rust, made of raw steel and cheap wood, tools designed to be brutal and indestructible. But Lieutenant George carried something different, something that seemed like a hallucination in that place of death. He protected against his chest a long wooden box marked with red letters that simply said, "Fragile." When he finally opened the box in the command tent under the yellow light of an oil lamp, the contrast was shocking. Inside, he retrieved not a weapon of war, but a civilian work of art. A Winchester Model 70 rifle, caliber .30-06. The stock was not made of industrial wood, but of hand-polished American walnut, gleaming like a luxury piece of furniture. The barrel had a deep, flawless blue finish, and mounted on top, like a technological jewel that didn't belong to that century, was a telescopic sight. Lyman Alaskan 2.5x increase. The reaction of the other officers was brutal and immediate. Dirty, bearded men, their uniforms rotten with sweat and their nerves frayed, looked at that elegant weapon and began to laugh. The scorn echoed through the tent. "What's this, Lieutenant? Did you bring your girlfriend along for the war on commission?" mocked a veteran captain, pointing at the rifle with disdain. Another officer kicked the empty box and asked, with a cynical smile, "You think the Japanese are going to pose for you like deer in the Illinois woods? This is a toy, son. The first time you crawl in the mud, this civilian bolt will jam. You'll die before you even take the lens cap off." They ridiculed the weight of the weapon. They laughed at the fact that it wasn't semi-automatic, requiring the shooter to manually reload after each shot. For the military mentality of the time, volume of fire was everything. Firing as fast as possible was the only doctrine. Surgical precision was seen as an unnecessary luxury, a sportsman's vanity. John George swallowed the humiliation whole. He wiped an imaginary smudge from the lens of his scope and said nothing. He knew something they didn't. Because outside that tent, the officer's laughter was merely a mask for utter panic. The 132nd Infantry Regiment wasn't fighting, it was being hunted like animals in a slaughterhouse. And worse, the hunter was invisible. In the last 72 hours, the battalion had lost 14 men, not in open combat, not in heroic bayonet charges. They died while filling their canteens at the stream. They died while lighting a cigarette or opening a ration can. A dry crack coming from nowhere, and a man would fall with a hole in the middle of his forehead or throat, dead before he hit the ground. The Japanese had mastered a terrifying art, vertical warfare. They weren't on the ground, hidden in holes or trenches. They were 30 meters high, tethered to the tops of gigantic banyan trees. They used camouflage nets, covered themselves with leaves, and remained motionless for days on end, with superhuman discipline, urinating and defecating in their own clothes so they wouldn't have to come down and reveal their position. They were ghosts, and against ghosts, the powerful and industrialized American Army was powerless. The M1 Garand rifle was an excellent assault weapon, but it had thick, simple iron sights. Trying to hit the head of a Japanese sniper hidden in the deep shadows of a tree 200 meters away using the iron sights of a Garand was impossible. It was like trying to perform eye surgery with a shovel. American soldiers fired blindly at the trees, wasting thousands of bullets in panic, only to be shot down one by the silent enemy who saw everything from above. The battalion was bleeding to death, paralyzed by fear. No one dared raise their head above the trench. Morale was broken. It was in this moment of utter despair that Captain Morris, the same man who had laughed at the deer gun days before, summoned John George again. The captain was sweating, with deep dark circles under his eyes, holding the report of the latest deaths in trembling hands. He looked at the immaculate civilian rifle in the lieutenant's hands. Military pride, arrogance, and jokes had vanished. Only the raw need for survival remained. "Lieutenant," he said in a hoarse voice, almost a whisper, "take that toy of yours, go outside, and for God's sake, stop this bloodshed. Kill those bastards or don't bother coming back." John George nodded. He pulled a magazine from his pocket and loaded 5 .30-06 rounds into the Winchester's internal magazine. The sound of the bolt closing, a click-clack, metallic and precise, that was the only answer he gave. The time for jokes was over. The hunt was about to begin. The designated area of operations, a deadly strip of land known on military maps as Point Cruz Woods, was not just a forest. It was a vertical labyrinth designed by nature to kill. Banyan trees dominated the landscape like ancient monsters, with aerial roots that resembled the tentacles of giant octopuses and 3-meter-thick trunks that formed impenetrable natural fortresses. George crossed the American security perimeter and entered this territory alone. Standard U.S. Army military doctrine required a support squad for any patrol, but George knew the mathematics of the jungle were different. A squad makes noise. Boots break branches, metal equipment clangs, men whisper. In that game of cat and mouse, noise was synonymous with suicide. A true hunter needs to be a ghost, an absence of sound. He didn't take a radio, that heavy metal box that hissed static and weighed on his back. He didn't take canned rations that could make noise when opened. Just a canteen with warm water, heavy pockets full of ammunition clips, and his Winchester. He found the ruins of a Japanese bunker that had been bombarded by naval artillery days before. It was a shell of cracked concrete and burnt coconut trunks, reeking of mold. George crawled into the rubble, using the deep shadows to conceal the glint of his skin and rifle. He took up his position with slow, almost surgical movements. First, he checked the angle of the sun. If the light hit the glass lens of the scope, the reflection would be a beacon announcing his position to the entire valley. He took a small flannel cloth which he kept in a waterproof pocket, as if it were gold, and cleaned the lenses of the scope. Lyman Alaskan, the 2.5x magnification wasn't much. Modern scopes have 10 or 20 times, which meant he couldn't rely solely on technology. He needed his eyes. The heat began to rise as the sun reached its zenith. The imaginary thermometer read 35 degrees, then 40. The air inside the bunker became still and suffocating. Sweat poured from his forehead and trickled into his eyes, the salt burning his cornea like acid. But he couldn't raise his hand to wipe his face. The movement of his hand would be visible hundreds of meters away. Insects bit his neck. Ants crawled up his sleeves, and the high-pitched buzzing of malaria-carrying mosquitoes was a constant torture in his ear. But he remained motionless. He slowed his breathing. The mental discipline of a champion shooter was now his only armor against the madness of waiting. He divided the green wall before him into visual quadrants. He wasn't looking at the forest. He was looking at textures. He searched branch by branch, leaf by leaf, looking for patterns that didn't belong in nature. Straight lines where everything should be curved. Solid colors where everything should be mottled. Patience is a more lethal weapon than gunpowder, and George had an endless supply of it. Time dragged on. An hour, 2 hours. At 9:17 a.m., patience paid off. 220 meters away, in a dense tangle of vines and broad leaves in a gigantic banyan tree, something stood out. To an ordinary soldier, it was just a shadow. But to George, it was an anomaly. A slight movement against the wind. It wasn't a leaf swaying, it was a shoulder adjusting. George brought his eye closer to the scope. The glass cleared the dark image of the tree. There he was. A Japanese sniper tied to the main trunk of the tree with hemp ropes to prevent him from falling if he fell asleep. The long barrel of his Arisaka Type 98 rifle was pointed at the American supply trail below. The enemy was perfectly camouflaged, covered in netting and foliage, invisible to the naked eye. But George's civilian optics revealed the fatal flaw: the dark outline of the uniform against the clear sky. George unlocked the Winchester. The sound of metal was muffled by the buzzing of insects. The silence in his head was absolute. The outside world vanished. Only the thin crosshair of the reticle and the target's chest existed. He mentally calculated the bullet's drop to 220 meters, no windage correction needed. He exhaled half the air from his lungs, creating a natural pause in his trembling body. His calloused index finger pressed the trigger with progressive smoothness, feeling the spring's resistance until it broke. The crack, the shot pierced the tropical morning like a dry thunderclap. The Winchester recoiled against his shoulder with a comforting familiarity, the recoil of a well-made tool. The sound was surgical, unlike the chaotic metallic rumble of infantry battles. Through the sights, George didn't need to guess the outcome. He kept his eyes open during the recoil and saw. The enemy sniper, struck in the center of the mass, dropped his weapon. His body slumped forward, the safety ropes holding him for a brief moment before giving way. He plummeted, breaking rotten branches and tearing leaves in his 30-meter freefall until he hit the jungle floor with a dull, final thud. But the job wasn't finished. George's instinct screamed. Japanese doctrine dictated operations in pairs. Always a shooter and a spotter nearby, usually in the same tree or the adjacent one. If he relaxed now to celebrate, he would die. George gripped the bolt handle. With a fluid movement, practiced 1,000 times in competitions, he pulled back, clack, ejecting the hot brass capsule which leaped, smoking, into the mud. He pushed forward, click, loading a new cold bullet into the chamber and locking the mechanism. Seconds later, his theory was confirmed. Panic is a soldier's greatest enemy. He saw a sudden movement in the tree next to the first. The dead sniper's partner, terrified by the sound of the shot and unaware of where the death came from, made the fatal mistake. He tried to move. He tried to climb down to escape. The quick movement drew George's eye like a magnet. The target was now in motion, descending the trunk. George tracked the shape with his scope, leading the target slightly. The second shot was as clinical and devoid of emotion as the first. The bullet pierced the foliage and found its target. The observer fell backward, his body hitting the trunk before falling into the void. 2 elite enemies, 2 shots. Less than 60 seconds. George didn't get up. He didn't run to check the bodies and grab souvenirs. That's amateurish and dies young. He remained frozen in position, reloading his rifle with a new 5-round clip, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline. He waited. The sun continued to beat down on the jungle. At 10:45, he took down the third, a sniper who tried to investigate the bodies. At 11:30, the fourth. At midday, the silence of the jungle had been broken 5 times by the distinct, terrifying sound of his hunting rifle. 5 Japanese ghosts, men who had terrorized the battalion for days, lay dead on the forest floor, devoured by ants. When George finally retreated to friendly lines to replenish water and ammunition, the atmosphere in the camp had changed dramatically. The jeers had evaporated. The same men who had laughed at his toy gun and made jokes about deer that morning now formed a silent, respectful line. They craned their necks, dirty and tired, just to see the rifle that was clearing the forest. They no longer saw an eccentric civilian sportsman. They saw their only hope of surviving this hell. But George, wiping the mud from his boots, knew the easy part was over. The enemy now knew he existed. And tomorrow they wouldn't just be waiting in the trees, they would be coming down to hunt him. The dawn of the third day, January 23rd, brought not sunlight. It brought a wall of water. A torrential monsoon rain poured down on Guadalcanal, transforming the jungle into a gray, noisy and miserable swamp. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. The world became a blur of water and mud. But what changed that day was not just the weather. It was the soul of the enemy. The jungle seemed different, more hostile, more watchful, as if the trees had eyes. The Japanese weren't stupid, far from it. They were hardened veterans, survivors of brutal campaigns in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. They saw the pattern. They understood that their best sharpshooters, the elite of the Imperial Infantry, men trained to blend in with nature, were being wiped off the map, one by one, silently. They realized there was a new predator operating in those ruins, someone who didn't play by the rules of ordinary Marines. The dynamic had radically changed. The hunted had become the hunter, and the Japanese command decided it was time to stop hiding and start fighting back with brute force, technology, and ruthless cunning. George felt it in his skin. While waiting for the rain to pass, huddled under a rotting tarp, he felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him. When the rain finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, hot vapor rising from the ground like smoke from dry ice, George spotted his sixth target. It was a reckless sniper, perhaps exhausted by the rainy night, who had let the sun reflect off the lens of his scope for a fraction of a second. It was enough. George made up the distance, controlled his breathing, and fired. The sixth sniper fell, dead before he heard the sound of the shot. But the silence that followed the shot did not last. It was broken almost instantly by a sound that every soldier fears more than any other, a hissing, high-pitched, mechanical sound. Thump, thump, thump. They weren't rifles. They were Type 89 knee mortars. The Japanese had changed tactics. They weren't trying, "See, George." They were listening, George. They had scattered forward observers throughout the woods with the sole mission of listening for the dry, distinct click of the .30-06 hunting rifle and triangulating their position based on the acoustics. The first explosion shook the ground 40 meters away, sending a shower of black earth and shattered roots flying. George felt the shockwave in his teeth. He knew how artillery worked. They were walking with the shots, adjusting their aim with each explosion until they hit the center. The second explosion landed 20 meters away, bursting a tree and covering George in splinters of wood. The third would fall directly on him. George didn't think. Survival instinct took over. He clutched the Winchester to his chest to protect the sights and rolled out of the shelter, landing awkwardly in a ditch filled with mud and twisted roots. Seconds later, the world behind him vanished in a flash of orange and black. A mortar shell struck his former position, turning the hole where he had been seconds before into a smoking crater. He was alive, but his ears rang violently, and he knew. They didn't just want to kill him. They wanted to vaporize him. Dirty, deafened from the concussion, and bleeding from dozens of scratches, he crawled through the mud like a lizard, moving inches at a time so as not to disturb the vegetation. He repositioned himself 100 meters to the north, behind the trunk of a huge fallen tree covered in moss. He needed to calm down. His heart pounded so hard against his ribs that he feared the vibration would throw his aim off. It was then, while scanning the area with sweat-burning eyes, that he saw something that made the blood run cold in his veins. 180 meters away, in a low palm tree, was a Japanese soldier. The position was ridiculous, absurd. The soldier was visible. He was too low. He was poorly camouflaged, with only a few palm leaves covering his helmet. He was practically offering himself as a target, looking the wrong way. George's finger instinctively went to the trigger of the Winchester. It was an easy shot, a textbook shot, the kind of shot he made in his sleep. But his brain, trained in thousands of hours of competition and tactical discipline, sent an emergency signal to his hand. It seems something is wrong. This is too easy. Veteran snipers don't make rookie mistakes on the third day of a deadly hunt. They don't sit in low, exposed palm trees unless they want to be seen. George understood the move with cold horror. A shiver ran down his sweat-soaked spine. This was bait. A sacrificable soldier. The tactic was brilliantly cruel. The Japanese commander had ordered a man to expose himself to die, hoping the American sniper would bite. The moment George fired at the soldier in the palm tree, the muzzle flash and recoil would reveal his new location. And the real assassin, the true master marksman, the best they had, would be hiding somewhere nearby, motionless, his sights already locked on George's area, waiting for just that second of distraction to put a bullet in his skull. George began to sweat. He removed his finger from the trigger guard. He ignored the easy bait in the palm tree, which was now moving purposefully to attract attention. He began a methodical visual scan, ignoring the obvious and searching for the hidden. He searched in the deep shadows, in the trees behind and above the bait. He searched for the negative space, where the light didn't pass through. A minute passed. 2 minutes. The tension was physical, aching in the muscles. The soldier in the palm tree glanced at his watch, impatient. George ignored him. Then he saw the anomaly. In a dark, tall banyan tree about 80 meters behind the bait, perfectly hidden by a dense curtain of vines, there was something that wasn't wood. It was a straight line in the middle of the organic chaos. The dull, almost imperceptible glint of a rifle barrel, motionless, pointed like a finger of death exactly at the area where George was hiding. The Japanese hunter was there, waiting, patient as a statue. It was a mental chess game worth his life. George had a split second to act before the Japanese man realized he had been discovered. If he missed, he would die. If he hesitated, he would die. George took a deep breath, drawing the warm, humid air into his lungs one last time. He completely ignored the human decoy. He aligned the Lyman crosshair in the darkness of the banyan tree, focusing on the dark mass behind the vines where the sniper's head should be. He calculated the bullet's trajectory. Crack. The Winchester spat fire. The impact was visible. The sniper hidden in the banyan tree, hit in the head, had his body thrown backward, plummeting from the tree and taking with him the camouflage net and broken branches. The Japanese plan had crumbled in a second. The decoy in the palm tree, realizing that the shot hadn't hit him and that his protector was dead, panicked completely. He tried to jump from the tree to escape, but George was already operating the weapon. With desperate mechanical speed, he cycled the bolt. Clack, click. The capsule flew. He adjusted his aim for the palm tree. The second shot hit the bait while it was still trying to descend. George had won the duel of wits. He had killed both the master and the bait. But the sound of the two quick shots echoed through the valley like a dinner bell, loud and clear. He had revealed their exact position to the entire enemy army. And now, the subtle game was over. He could hear the furious shouts, the sound of dozens of boots in the mud, branches breaking and metal clanging. The entire infantry was coming to finish the job, and they would take no prisoners. The sounds of the jungle changed instantly. The birds, which had been singing, fled in flocks, a dark cloud rising into the sky. The natural buzzing of insects was silenced and replaced by the terrifying mechanical sound of steel bolts being operated and orders shouted in Japanese. The camouflage was over. The war of shadows and subtleties was finished. George didn't need to wait to see what came next. The air around him began to crackle and hiss. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Nambu light machine guns began tearing through the vegetation. The bullets didn't just pierce, they pulverized. Tree trunks exploded in showers of sharp splinters. Giant ferns were cut in half as if by an invisible scythe. The dirt around George began to boil from the impact of hundreds of projectiles, raising geysers of mud and stone. George ran. He didn't run like a soldier in tactical training. He ran like a hunted animal driven by pure, primal panic. He lunged through the dense undergrowth, ignoring the thorny wait-a-minute vines that tore at his uniform and left gashes on his arms and face. His lungs burned as if he were breathing fire. He slipped in the mud, fell, got up, and kept going, while bullets whizzed past his ears like supersonic wasps, ripping chunks of bark from trees inches from his head. He needed solid cover, and he needed it now. The vegetation wouldn't stop those bullets. Paper and flesh don't stop lead. His only visible escape route was a natural drainage ditch leading to an old bomb crater, a deep scar in the earth left by a B-17 bomber weeks earlier. He lunged to the edge and slid uncontrollably down the steep earthen wall. The crater bottom was filled with stagnant rainwater, a foul brown soup of mud, oil, rotting vegetation, animal feces, and mosquito larvae. He plunged in. The thermal shock was immediate. The fetid water rose to his chest, then to his neck. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of sulfur and sewage. Instinctively, in an act of professional preservation, he raised the Winchester above his head with both arms. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but he knew the golden rule. If mud got into the precision bolt mechanism or the chamber, the gun would become a useless piece of metal and wood. The next time he pulled the trigger, the pressure would explode the breach in his face. George sank into the putrid water, bending his knees, leaving only his nose and eyes above the murky surface, like a crocodile waiting on the shore. He became a submerged statue, trying to control his gasping breath so as not to create waves. Then the voices came. It wasn't 2 or 3 scouts. It was an extermination squad, the heavy infantry. He could hear the heavy boots splashing in the mud around the crater's rim. The unmistakable metallic sound of long bayonets being fitted to Arisaka rifles. They were surrounding the hole. George's heart pounded so hard against his ribs that he feared the vibration in the water would give away their position. They were 2 meters away from him, separated only by a mud bank. Suddenly, the sunlight was blocked. A Japanese soldier appeared on the edge of the crater, looking straight down. Time froze. The universe was reduced to that gaze. The soldier saw George's eyes gleaming in the dark water. Eye contact was immediate, intimate, and terrifying. The Japanese opened his mouth to shout the warning, beginning to raise his rifle to fire. George had no time to think, plan, or pray. The reaction was pure muscle reflex. He lifted the dripping gun out of the water, aimed without sighting, and fired point blank. Bang! The sound inside the crater was deafening. The soldier was hit in the chest, the force of the impact throwing him backward, out of sight, without him making a sound. And here began George's nightmare of choosing a weapon. If he had been carrying a semi-automatic M1 Garand, he could have fired 8 times in 2 seconds, sweeping the rim. But he had a Winchester hunting rifle. Each shot required a complex and slow mechanical dance. Click. The right hand releases the trigger and grips the bolt handle. Pull. Pull back forcefully to eject the spent capsule that flies spinning in the air. Push forward to drag a new bullet from the magazine into the chamber. Lock the bolt down. It seemed to take an eternity. As he frantically maneuvered the bolt with his wet, slippery hands, 2 other soldiers appeared at the edge, drawn by the gunshot and the shouts. George fired again. The water around him trembled with the shockwave. The second man was hit in the throat and fell forward, sliding into the crater, his body hitting the water and tinging the brown soup a vivid red. Click-clack, eject, load. Sweat and rainwater got into his eyes. The third soldier fired. The Japanese bullet hit the water inches from George's face, throwing mud into his eyes and momentarily blinding him. George fired blindly, guided only by his instinct. The soldier screamed and retreated, wounded or frightened. But the mathematics of war is cruel and unbeatable. George had loaded 5 bullets. He had fired 3, 2 remained. And he could hear more voices shouting, coming from all sides of the perimeter. Then he heard the sound that sealed his fate in that position. The metallic clang of grenade pins being pulled. They weren't going down, they were going to drop explosives into the hole. If he stayed in that crater for another 5 seconds, he would be turned into mincemeat by hydrostatic concussion. George knew the position was lost. He used the momentary confusion and the gray smoke from the gunfire hanging over the water to get out, digging his boots into the mud and scaling the opposite wall of the crater with a desperate strength he didn't know he possessed. Covered in black mud from head to toe, looking like a swamp monster, he emerged into the jungle on the other side. He ran. There were no tactics now, only animal survival. He ran in zigzags, tripping over roots, banging shoulders against trees, while the forest behind him was destroyed by the explosions of grenades that fell into the crater water seconds after he emerged. The shockwave pushed him from behind. He had 2 bullets, no breath, and an entire army on his heels. The hunt had become a race against death, and the finish line was miles away. 40 minutes later, the jungle spat John George back. He didn't run to the American lines. He staggered. When he finally broke through the line of trees, a nervous American sentry almost opened fire. What emerged from the undergrowth didn't look like a United States Army officer. It looked like a creature fashioned from the swamp itself. George was covered in a crust of black mud and dried blood. His uniform was torn to shreds by the vines, exposing his cut skin. He could barely breathe, his lungs wheezing like punctured bellows. But in his hands, gripped with a white firmness at the knuckles, was the Winchester. He ignored the doctors who rushed toward him. He ignored the astonished stares of the soldiers who stopped digging trenches to watch him pass. He walked straight to the central command tent. Upon entering, the contrast was stark. The air inside was still, smelling of tobacco and coffee. Clean-shaven officers were bent over maps. Silence fell over the room like a guillotine as George entered, dripping foul water onto the command floor. He walked to the map table. With a heavy movement, he placed the Winchester on the papers. The gun was muddy on the outside, the stock scratched, but the bolt mechanism was closed, protecting the chamber. The gun smelled of burnt gunpowder and violence. Captain Morris, the same man who had mocked him days before, looked at the lieutenant, then at the gun, and paled. George's verbal report was dry, technical, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. Sector 4 clear, sir. 11 elite snipers confirmed and eliminated in 4 days. 1 infantry squad repelled in close combat. Critical ammunition. Organized resistance in that area is over. No one laughed. No one joked about hunting deer. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, looked at the maps, where the red danger zone markings had been erased one by a single man with a civilian rifle. He looked at George and saw something new in the lieutenant's eyes. He no longer saw a subordinate, he saw a weapon of war. John George's story proves that skill trumps equipment. If you're enjoying this insane journey through military history and want to see more forgotten heroes brought to light, smash that like button now. It helps the algorithm understand that this content has value. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more wars to cover. Back to the narrative. The colonel broke the silence with an order that would change the course of the battle on the island. "Lieutenant," he said, "I have 40 men qualified as sharpshooters in this battalion, but they don't know how to hunt. They know how to shoot at paper targets. I want you to teach them what you know. Teach them how to be invisible." Right there, in the middle of the war zone, under the distant sound of artillery, an improvised sniper school was born. George didn't teach military regulations. He took ordinary Marines and taught them how to breathe, how to track footprints in the mud, how to use patience as a weapon, and how to blend into the shadows. He used his Winchester as the gold standard of what precision could achieve. Within 2 weeks, George's students, now hunters, swept away the last pockets of Japanese resistance from the island. The green hell had been tamed. Weeks later, George's luck finally wavered. He was wounded in the shoulder by a stray bullet during a patrol, but his war was far from over. His reputation as the Hunter of Illinois had already crossed the ocean and reached the ears of high command in the China-Burma-India theater of operations. A new secret unit was being formed for suicide missions of deep infiltration behind enemy lines. They were called Merrill's Marauders. They needed the best. They needed ghosts. The last image we have of John George on Guadalcanal is of him boarding a transport ship, his arm in a sling, limping to the gangplank. But in his right hand, he carried the wooden crate. The Winchester Model 70 was no longer a hunting rifle, much less a toy. It had become a relic, a legend forged in blood and mud. John George proved to the most powerful and industrialized army in the world an old and brutal lesson. On the battlefield, technology will never replace the cold courage and instinct of a man who refuses to make mistakes. In the jungle, the rifle is just the tool. The weapon is the man.